What's up everybody, Nick with Alex Training Group, and today I want to go over with you guys rifle recoil management. And more specifically, things to look at in your training in regards to how to know if you're actually mounting the rifle properly. What are some principles that we should be looking towards? What are some techniques that we should try? And then what are some drills that we can use as kind of awareness type of drills to figure out if we're actually getting the most out of our training and are we actually mounting the rifle like we should? We'll also go over some things like rifle setup, how to set your rifle up to get the most out of your training. So stay tuned, let's dive into it. All right, so let's start off with some of the principles that we'll look to in regards to the way that we go about mounting the rifle. These principles are going to give us a very good idea of if the techniques that we're trying at the time are actually working or not. So I think the very first principle that everyone needs to be aware of, and this is it's going to go with rifle and with pistol as well. The gun needs to behave in a very predictable manner, meaning the way that I mount the gun should facilitate the gun returning back down to the exact same spot every single time. So in other words, if I put the dot, right, obviously we're not talking about holdovers or anything like that, but if I put the dot in the center of this white paster, press the trigger, the gun lifts. I'll be really honest with you guys. Don't look at where it lifts to, right? I think it's kind of counterproductive to start watching the dot and start looking at, hey, oh, it lifts over here and goes over here, or it lifts this high or whatever. Look at where the gun comes back down to. So in other words, if I press the trigger and the gun lifts and it comes back down to a different spot every single time, you have to start asking yourself the question of what is causing that. And the answer is you. You're putting different inputs into the gun, right? And this is making the gun behave in a very unpredictable manner. So we want the gun to behave very predictably. So when I press the trigger, the dot lifts and it comes straight back down to the exact same spot that it left from. That is a very predictable gun. When you have a very predictable gun or a mount that facilitates a very predictable recoil pattern, this is going to help you guys be very accurate and shoot as fast as you would like to go. The next thing that we need to look at is we need to be able to mount the gun in such a way to where I can bang on the trigger for as long as I want to or need to, and the gun doesn't move off the target. In other words, I'm not putting any sort of input when I press the trigger to move the gun off of the target. So let's go ahead and dive into some of these techniques that will help support these principles that we just chatted about. All right, so we're going to talk about the 4 points of contact on a rifle. You've got the forend, you've got the grip, you've got the butt stock, which is going to go up against your shoulder, as well as your cheek weld. All 4 of these things, you can put different pressures into the gun. Now, there's a couple very common ones, and that's what I'm going to try to help highlight here. It's like, hey, there's some very common things that people do in regards to putting extra input or unwanted input into the gun to make it behave in a very unpredictable manner. Let's start at the back, work our way to the front. The butt stock needs to go in a place where it's going to help like put meat behind the gun, right? I don't want to have to fight the gun. If I put the butt stock up here like this and the gun lifts because there's nothing in back of all of that mass going back and forth, right? Like if I have it really high, there's nothing in back of this butt stock to help absorb some of the recoil that's coming back on the gun. What you'll see then is the gun behave in a very unpredictable manner. So what I would recommend is putting the stock somewhere about right there. Maybe kind of at the top of your shoulder, if not like sunk down, maybe like 1 inch to 1.5 inches below the top of your shoulder. I'd also recommend not doing something like sticking it in your pec or on your chest or something like that, because then what you end up seeing people do is they bring their head all the way down to the gun like this. It's like they have to bury their head in order to see their dot. And whenever you do this kind of stuff, you'll instantly feel like tension and stuff in your back. Like I immediately feel that. As soon as I bury my head down like that, I feel tension in my back, my shoulders, and my neck. So I definitely wouldn't recommend doing that. I'd recommend putting the butt stock kind of somewhere in between your pec and your shoulder, kind of somewhere in between right there. There's enough mass behind the gun or behind the stock to help absorb the recoil, and it's also in a place where I'm not going to feel a ton of tension and end up putting unwanted input into the gun as I'm firing it. The next thing we'll look at is cheek weld. Now, this is something that I think is definitely not highlighted enough in training, and I see people that have different cheek welds basically every single time they shoot. Again, one of the points of contact is a cheek weld. If your cheek is doing something like coming off and on the stock as you're firing the gun, which, believe it or not, I see a lot of in classes due to a couple things that I'll go over here in a second, but your cheek weld should be the exact same pressure every single time. The key here is all 4 points of contact should have the exact same amount of pressure every single time. If you're putting different pressures on either of the 4 points of contact, you're gonna get a gun that is not behaving in a very predictable manner. So what the cheek weld should look like is something like this. I like lifting the shoulder up into my cheek like that. This way I'm not having to like kind of push my head down on the stock or anything like that. Because again, I feel a ton of tension in my back, shoulders, and neck when I start doing things like this. So what I like to do is just basically lift the gun up by just shrugging my shoulder up. What that's gonna do is it's gonna help keep your cheek weld there. Like it's gonna help keep your cheek weld in the exact same spot every single time. This is very important. I see a lot of people with very high mounts. Now, I'm not a huge fan of super high mounts, but I also am a fan of using them in certain situations. Like this particular gun has a Wilcox mount on it. This is the 410, I believe, not to make this about, you know, a bunch of gear, but 410 with a absolute co-witness sight makes this around a 193, so it's not super high. But some of the really high stuff, like the Hydra mount, stuff like that, what I end up seeing is guys that just barely have their chin touching the stock, and then as they fire the gun, it's almost like their chin is coming off of the stock every single time. When that's happening, you're putting different inputs on the gun, right? That is a point of contact. Again, you have to have a solid, consistent cheek weld every single time. This is also gonna help you do things like target focus a whole lot better because you don't see the gun doing this in your vision because your head is no longer mounted to the stock. You wanna have a good, solid cheek weld with firm pressure on the stock. The next thing that we're gonna talk about is our firing hand. Now this is where you will see people's opinions start to change back and forth. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you guys like the way that I'm gonna do it here. This is not the way, this is the way that I go about doing it because I see the gun behave in a very predictable manner when I mount the gun like this. So I don't like to pull at all with my firing hand. And what I see is, or what I feel when I pull really hard into my shoulder with my firing hand, in other words, like pulling back with my firing hand, what I feel and see is this hand tense up a lot. And when you tense this hand up, things like being able to run the trigger really fast, like you'll lose dexterity in your trigger finger, things like that will happen. You will also see a lot more sympathetic movement in your hand when your firing hand tenses up. So I don't like pulling into my shoulder with my firing hand at all. Like I just want this hand to more or less be along for the ride and run the trigger. Basically, the only job that my firing hand has is to run the trigger and not move the gun. One of the symptoms that I see when people kind of go the other way, right, where they're pulling really hard, maybe they know they're doing that, maybe they don't, but they'll pull really hard with the firing hand and you'll see this firing hand like flex because your fingers, you're basically pressing the trigger with your entire hand and you'll see the gun kind of do this in recoil, right? It'll kind of rock back and forth. If you guys are seeing that while you're shooting, that is most likely a symptom of you putting a bunch of firing hand tension into the gun and you're causing the gun to kind of wobble around. Next thing we'll look at is the support hand. This is something that I got from Frank Proctor probably 10 years ago. And I've stuck with this because I think it is a very, very good way to mount the gun in such a way that like you'll be able to replicate this every time. So you're gonna grab the rail somewhere in the middle, kind of like that. So you have a slight bend in your elbow. If you're straight like this, there's not really a way to pull back. I would be kind of somewhere in the middle. You don't want to be all the way back here, but I would also tell you that back here is a whole lot better than having your arm straight, right? So kind of somewhere in the middle, so you have this bend in your elbow. Let's allow this elbow to hang, right? We're not gonna flare it out like that. We're not gonna do that whole chicken wing thing. We're just gonna let this elbow hang. Now, as soon as you drop that elbow, you will feel pressure back into your shoulder. That pressure is being facilitated by a very, very easy way to put that pressure back into your shoulder. In other words, I'm not really using a ton of muscle to pull this gun back into my shoulder. This is very, very important, because if you guys try to pull 110% with that hand, pull 110% with that hand, that 110% quickly turns into 50 to 60, then maybe it goes back up, and then maybe it goes back down to 30%. In other words, like, what you will feel is like your support hand leaving the exercise, and then you'll start feeling different inputs, you know, into the gun with your firing hand side. Maybe it's your whole shoulder pushing into the gun, whatever. But if you put a ton of effort into it, chances of you being able to hold that amount of effort is pretty damn slim. So just allowing that elbow to hang and pull that rifle back into your shoulder, I think Frank calls this easy effort. I would tend to 100% agree with him on that. Easy effort is very important because you'll be able to hold that same amount of pressure for the entire string of fire. And the types of pressures that you're putting on the gun are very, very key in this. And consistent pressures is also very, very key in this. Like, you don't want to put, you know, say 110% on the rail, and then maybe 50% on the grip, and then maybe you give up on the rail and you're putting different pressures on the gun as you're firing it. This is what's going to create a very unpredictable recoil pattern. So let's go ahead and dive into some of the things that you can do in your training to kind of assess, are you doing this properly or not? All right, first little awareness drill that we're going to do is group shooting. So all we're going to do on the beep is going to bring the rifle up, fire 5 rounds. Now, while we're doing this, we should be paying close attention to how is the rifle behaving. In other words, like, what do I see it doing? Is the dot coming straight back down to the spot that I'm looking at, or is it coming down in different spots each time? Okay, and also, what do I feel like the rifle is doing? In other words, like, am I keeping the exact same pressures on the gun throughout the entire string of fire? Or am I doing something like allowing my support hand to come off of the gun, and then maybe the shoulder's getting involved, maybe this hand is starting to tense up and kind of push the gun around? If you're mounting the rifle properly, it should not feel like you're having to steer the gun back to the spot that you're trying to hit. Okay, so in other words, this should feel like it's very predictable. It should not feel like you're fighting the gun at all. This is not like an outcome-based drill. Like, you're not gonna walk down there and be like, hey, that's really great. Like, pat yourself on the shoulder. Like, all you're looking for here is, how is the gun behaving, and am I putting different inputs on the gun? How am I getting the rifle to behave in a very predictable manner, right? So let me give you guys a couple examples here. You do not want to shoot at this pace. All right, if you guys shoot at that pace, it is super easy, at least for the majority of people out there, to be fairly damn accurate. Like, all of those bullets essentially went in the exact same hole. And I'm not really able to see how the gun behaved because of how slow I was shooting. So again, you should be shooting at a pace that's kind of like if you're inside of 10 yards with a rifle, it should be like, maybe a 20 to a 25 type of split, right? Give you guys an example of that. Now, again, while you're doing that, am I keeping consistent pressure on the gun, or am I putting different pressures on the gun? I also think that you guys should do this at different distances. Do it at 10. I wouldn't recommend doing it inside of 10, by the way. Like, stay outside of 10 yards, but go from 10 to about 60 yards. I think it is super duper important for you guys to do this at least past 25 yards. You will see a lot in regards to the types of inputs that you're putting into the gun. Maybe they're unwanted, maybe they're wanted, whatever. Like, you'll see a lot in regards to, are you making the gun behave in a very predictable manner? If you guys are inside of 25, maybe 15, 10 yards, stuff like that, you need to be very, very critical of your group size inside of those distances. In other words, like, I would say, like, for myself, when I'm doing this, I want my group size to be baseball size or smaller. If I'm at 10, I really want it to be like the size of a golf ball, right? If it's any bigger than that, inside of 25, you are putting different inputs into the gun, And that's the stuff that we need to be very, very critical of inside of those distances, because it's going to be harder to tell inside of those distances what types of inputs you're putting on the gun. So I would highly recommend going 25, 50, 60 yards, stuff like that. Now, one very, very important thing to know, that when you're doing this group shooting thing, you need to be able to come up here and look at the group and assess, what exactly is happening. And this group is going to help you figure out what is happening with your mount. Is your mount very predictable, or is it not? And really what you're looking for with this is, if I'm looking at this spot, obviously you're going to have height over bore depending on the distance, but if you do have height over bore, like, what you're looking for is bullets concentric around the spot that you're looking. We're also looking for trends on the target. If they're all concentric, I would call that a trend, right? I would say, hey, the rifle is behaving in a very predictable manner. If there's maybe one over here, maybe just one, right? Okay, I had a flyer. That's the kind of stuff that's not super interesting to me. You want to look at trends, although you should be able to, kind of recall and articulate, like, hey, if you saw one way up here, and you sense like a high kind of wild flyer, you should be able to articulate why that happened, what you felt and what you saw. But if we're looking at trends, we're not looking for the one, we're looking for the many. So I would say, like, if this is your target and you had these seven, if you had these 7 rounds kind of like right here, you should be able to articulate why those happened, right? I would start calling this a trend, especially like if you didn't pace these and then maybe you shot 200 rounds on this drill from 10 yards to 50, and then you had a bunch, like, as you got further back, these kind of spread out even more. Like, this should key you into, what is exactly happening in regards to your mount, because that mount is not making the gun behave in a very predictable manner. It's making it behave in an unpredictable manner. And I would also say that, like, if you're a righty and you see like a left trend, there's one or maybe 2 things. It's usually the one thing that I see quite a bit of happen, and that's people trying to steer the gun with their support hand. So in other words, what they'll do is, like, the rifle will go off and then they're trying to pull down with their support hand, or trying to pull it in the direction that they want it to go. And what they end up doing is they overcorrect and go straight by the spot that they're trying to hit. And that's why you're starting to see those. The other thing that could happen is your firing side shoulder. Like, if your support hand loses the pressure pulling back into your shoulder pocket, your firing side shoulder can get involved and start pushing on the gun. And as you can see, the muzzle starts to go to the left. For you lefties, it would be the opposite. So when we come down here and analyze this group, or take a look at this group, all we're trying to do is key ourselves into what's happening a little bit more. Maybe you saw this happen, maybe you didn't. If you didn't, this is a very good way to start analyzing the mount. All right, next drill that we're going to do is a drill called doubles. It's essentially 2 rapid fire pairs, or several rapid fire pairs in a row. And what you're trying to do here is basically look to a very small spot where you want to place bullets on that target the entire time, and press the trigger twice pretty much as fast as you possibly can. We're using this as a diagnostic tool. So again, just like the other drill, there's not really this is not an outcome-based drill. What you're looking for in this is just to make yourself aware of what you're doing, not only with your mount, but with your eyes as well. And the thing that you should be doing with your eyes is keeping your eyes on that small spot the entire time. This is not one sight picture, 2 trigger presses. I think that's kind of a misnomer that kind of goes around about this drill. This is looking the entire time and not allowing your eyes to be distracted by the dot lifting, right? Wherever you look, bullets typically go. So if I watch the dot lift, you typically will see bullets track in that direction. So you're trying to keep your eyes on the place where you're trying to put bullets. This is going to help the gun return to the spot that you're trying to hit. The other thing that you're going to try to be aware of, or try to assess with this, just like the other drill, is how am I mounting the gun? Is my mount staying the same? Do I have the exact same pressures throughout the entire string, or am I putting different pressures? And if I'm putting different pressures on the gun, which part of the mount am I doing that on, right? So this will allow you like a really good opportunity to help assess the way that you're doing things in regards to the mount. So we'll go ahead and shoot a group here. All All right. The fastest one was 18. I think at about 25, that's about pretty sporty. Basically what we're looking for, just like the other drill, right, is a group concentric around the spot that we're looking. Typically what you'll see, especially with doubles, the further you move back, the more this group will start to open up. Like if I shot doubles at like 40, I would totally expect to see some Charlies here, but what I would be wanting to see is them concentric around the spot that I was looking, and I was looking to about right here. So like bullets concentric around that spot, like that is a very good thing. And if they're not, is there a trend on the target? And if there is a trend on the target, this is going to help key you into things that you may not have known you're doing as you're firing those doubles. All right, so a little bit on rifle setup. How do you set your rifle up to make the most of your training? So you can do a lot of stuff with rifles. More specifically, the things that you can do in terms of muzzle devices to basically delete recoil is a lot of what people tend to do. I would not recommend that at all. I would recommend you guys getting something like this 3-prong flash hider, something similar to this without any sort of comp or anything like that. I wouldn't recommend doing things like adjustable gas blocks or any of that sort of thing. Have a regular duty style rifle. This rifle, it's not like it's going to, beat you up or anything when you guys go to shoot it, but it's going to give you input, right? It's going to make yourself way more aware of what is exactly happening. Conversely, if you put an adjustable gas block and some sort of big muzzle brake to recoil delete, you guys aren't going to be able to see anything in regards to the types of inputs that you're going to be putting into the gun or how the gun is behaving, right? Basically what you're going to see is the gun just go off, and it's going to feel like it almost doesn't even cycle. Now, if you're going to go out and shoot things like 3-gun, 2-gun, whatever, by all means, put a muzzle brake on it. But I think for training purposes, a 3-prong muzzle device, no adjustable gas block, regular duty style rifle is going to be the best for you guys in regards to getting the most out of your training. All right, that's what I got on recoil management and the rifle mount. Hopefully you guys are still sticking with me here. Hopefully this was helpful for you guys. I think the biggest thing that you guys should take away from this is you yourself have to actually go out to the range and fire all of these drills. Like if you gave me, say, 400 rounds, right? Like what would I do with that 400 rounds in a range session? Well, probably half of that would be dedicated to doing marksmanship type of stuff like this, exploring the mount. Like exploring the mount and marksmanship is the one thing that you really can't do in dry fire. So when you guys do come out in live fire, like I would highly recommend doing things like group shooting, 5 rounds, 6 rounds, bills, whatever, or doing things like doubles, right? These type of drills are gonna help you assess, are you mounting the gun properly and is it behaving in the way that you want it to behave? And with the key principles that we talked about in the very beginning of the video, making the gun behave predictably and making the gun behave in such a way that I can bang on the trigger for as long as I want to or need to, and I'm not moving the gun off of the target while I'm doing so. Like if you keep those principles in mind at all times, those are the things that are gonna help drive what you do in regards to technique in the mount. So hopefully this helps you guys out. If you guys have any questions, as always, drop them in the comment box below. Get out and train, guys.